Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, it's finally time to tackle Fallout 76 on PC. A game that I think is fair to say has disappointed a number of Fallout fans, and it's not just because the game is a technical disaster on both PC and consoles, but the game itself just hasn't lived up to the Fallout name, judging by harsh reviews from critics and even harsher reviews from gamers. Personally, I'm a big Fallout fan, and this multiplayer-only title is absolutely not what I wanted from the next Fallout game, especially after Fallout 4 was a tad disappointing, but in any case, there still seems to be a core fan base for Fallout that is currently playing and enjoying this game, which is good news because you really want other players in the game world if you are going to jump in and give it a try. Anyway, this video isn't really about whether Fallout 76 is a good game, it's about how the game runs on PC and whether there is anything you guys can do to get the game running better. So as is standard for these videos, we've benchmarked almost every setting in the game to give you the full breakdown of how each graphics option impacts performance and what the differences are in visual quality. To get the usual housekeeping out of the way, we benchmarked this game on our Core i7-8700K test rig, overclocked to 4.9 GHz with 16 GB of DDR4 memory, and for this game we were only able to use an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 for testing. The reason for this is it's very difficult to get repeatable benchmark runs in a multiplayer title like Fallout 76. In fact, the game basically does everything possible to make sure you can't do anything consistently. So it took much longer to benchmark this game than most others. Even something like Battlefield 5 multiplayer is easier to benchmark than Fallout 76. So this severely limited the amount of graphics cards that we're able to test in our usual graphics comparisons. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, every setting in the game with the exception of the fade sliders requires a full restart of the game to apply, and not just a quit to the main menu, a full-blown restart. And then on top of that, each time you load the game, you are sent into a different game world, which thanks to the dynamic weather and time of day system, could be in completely different conditions to the last time you loaded. For testing, we like the in-game conditions to be as similar as possible, so this required a lot of quitting and reloading the game to get into a world with the same time of day and weather. But it's worse than that, because once you're in the game, there's not a lot of scope for positioning a benchmark run. Long story short, I ended up committing suicide hundreds of times so I could restart each benchmark at the same spawn point, and sometimes my suicide attempts would fail. Benchmarking this game wasn't a lot of fun, which is no doubt why Steve doesn't even want to touch it for a big GPU benchmark. After roaming around West Virginia to find the most intensive areas of the game, I actually settled on a benchmark run just outside Vault 76, which is basically where you start the game. With expansive views, this is one of the more stressful areas in the game, along with several other mountaintops that stretch the game's draw distance. So how does Fallout 76 run? Well, to be frank, like a steaming pile of dog turds. I specifically waited a couple of weeks to test Fallout 76 because I wanted to give Bethesda a reasonable amount of time to fix the early technical issues that would no doubt crop up. I mean, this is a Bethesda game using the creation engine. There were always going to be a load of problems at launch. But as the game runs right now using version 1.0.1.14, it's pretty much a joke. Apparently there are more patches in the works, but seriously, this is not a game that runs well, and it's not a game that looks good either. So before I get into the graphics comparison, let's look at all the problems with this game's performance and presentation. To begin with, the latest patch fixed the long-running issue with the creation engine that tied physics to frame rate. Previously, when you uncapped your frame rate in these games, in-game physics would run faster, and for a multiplayer title, this would mean some players moving faster than others, depending on each player's performance. For Fallout 76, they initially capped everyone to 64 FPS and forced VSync on to prevent this being exploited. But with version 1.0.1.14, that frame rate limit has been removed and physics are no longer tied directly to frame rate, so you can play at 100 FPS without essentially cheating. Now you might be thinking, that's a major step forward for Bethesda. Finally, they've fixed an issue with their engine that's been around for 10 years or more. I mean, it's pathetic that it's taken them this long, but whatever, progress is progress. However, the game still does not have a VSync toggle, so by default, you will be capped to your monitor's refresh rate. If you want to disable VSync, you have to edit the Fallout 76 prefs.ini file and add in iPresentInterval =0. Yep, you actually have to edit an ini file to get this basic feature in the game. But wait, it's worse than that. The game does not run well at high frame rates. On our RTX 2080 test system, the game was consistently smooth running at 60 FPS with VSync on. But as soon as I turn VSync off and start running the game at say 70 to 80 FPS, it's remarkably choppy. The game is smooth below 60 FPS, but there's something about breaking the 60 FPS barrier that this game does not like. Did you think that was the only issue with Fallout 76's performance? Well, let me tell you about how the game runs in general. Using an RTX 2080 at 4K using the Ultra preset, I was getting around 60 FPS in the more intensive areas, up to maybe 80 FPS in the best areas, but as low as 40 to 50 FPS in others. So performance is a little better than Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but around the same mark as Battlefield 5 and Hitman 2, just comparing it to some recent other titles. So on face value, that puts Fallout 76 around the same mark as other AAA releases of 2018, a little less intensive than the top-end titles and a little more intensive than others. But oh my god, have you actually seen how this game looks? This is not a good looking game. That's being extremely generous. I'd say most aspects of this game look like complete garbage. Steve says I'm not allowed to swear on the channel, but there's a word that starts with S and means fecal matter that comes to mind when looking at this game's graphics. The lighting system is perhaps the most advanced aspect in that you can get some nice bloom and god rays, and the game is a lot more vibrant than Fallout 4, which makes exploring the world more pleasant. But basically, nothing else about the graphics have been upgraded since Fallout 4, a game that came out in 2015 and at the time looked pretty bad. It's been 3 years since Fallout 4, and we're at the point where the graphics are perhaps 5 to 6 years behind what we've come to expect from modern games. The issues are plentiful. The foliage system in this game is decidedly last generation, and considering most of the game world is filled with trees and grass, it's hard not to notice. Even worse than that are just the general objects, structures, items, and everything else that fills out the game world. We're looking at low geometry models that lack detail, most of which are reused from Fallout 4 and often with low quality textures. The material system in particular is not up to scratch, where modern games are emulating the reflective properties of dirt, metals, rocks, and so on for their lighting system. In Fallout 76, basically every element looks flat and again, last generation. The shadow system is awful. I'll get into that more in a moment, as is the water simulation. Plus you get typical Bethesda animations, which are janky to say the least. Even the map, which is basically just a 2D image, performs like rubbish when it shouldn't. And that's without mentioning the suite of technical issues with quests and keyboard controls on PC, particularly for menus, that are like the person that mapped these out has never played a PC game ever before. When you pair this level of visual fidelity with performance akin to a flagship AAA title in 2018, it's really hard to swallow. A game like Battlefield 5 has expansive open areas similar to parts of the Fallout 76 map, yet it runs better than Fallout 76 for the most part and looks at least a generation better in the graphics department. I also think of an open world game like Far Cry 5 or even Watch Dogs 2 from 2016, and Fallout 76 is so far behind these titles at a similar performance level it's almost funny. So the question then becomes, can we fix this game to deliver decent enough performance that matches the visual quality that we're actually getting? And once again, this is where Fallout 76 disappoints, because not only are there very few graphic settings, a bunch of them barely do anything for performance and visual quality. Here you can see the game's presets roughly side by side in our benchmark run, and honestly there's not a lot of difference between ultra, high and medium. The biggest changes come in subtle tweaks to the lighting system, including shadow quality, plus a few small differences to draw distance. It's really only when you get to the low preset that you get obvious reductions to shadow quality and draw distance. And this plays out when looking at the performance difference between the 4 presets in one of the most intensive areas in Fallout 76. If you want to improve performance in these areas, dropping from ultra to high only sees a 4% boost to average frame rates, while moving to medium you'll get about 10% more frames. Only when you get to low do you see a jump of 25%, and that's with basically every setting except texture quality set to its lowest value. Like with Hitman 2, this sort of scaling is going to hurt those with lower end GPUs attempting to gain more performance. If you're hovering around 30 FPS for example, a 25% jump moving from ultra to low isn't going to get you above 40 FPS. yes. Even if you account for a generous 40% jump, as lower end cards tend to benefit more from lower end settings, Fallout 76 still isn't one of those games that scales well for those with budget systems. The best games for scaling tend to have at least a 50% performance improvement from their highest to lowest presets. Even Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which we criticize for being poorly optimized, delivers a 70% performance uplift moving from its ultra high to low preset, giving lower end gamers a chance to enjoy the title, albeit with poor visuals. Moving into the individual settings, first up we have texture quality, which is straightforward and remains on ultra for all 4 presets. This is really only a setting I'd recommend changing if you are hitting VRAM limits, because there is a loss to quality moving from ultra to high and especially to medium. Then when you use the low setting, texture quality is very poor. And it's only using the low setting that you'll see a significant 5% boost to performance. The other 3 settings don't impact performance significantly on cards with plenty of memory. Water quality is an interesting one because I couldn't really spot many differences between the 3 modes looking at the rivers in Fallout 76. It's a bit hard to tell with the differences to the lighting system in each shot, but yeah, almost no changes. If anything, I'd say the higher settings have slightly better screen space reflections, but we're not looking at a significant difference. In terms of performance, there is a bit to be gained from reducing quality to either medium or low relative to high. The quality of the water in this game isn't great to begin with, so honestly, turning this down to low to get around a 4% improvement to performance in water-heavy areas is probably going to be worth it. I'd also consider using medium if you can spot a difference. Lighting quality is one of the more demanding settings in the game, and visually it was hard to get some comparison shots that really show the differences, again due to the dynamic time of day system the game uses. So these shots aren't fantastic at showing the differences, but basically it boils down to the level of volumetric lighting, bloom, and god rays. Low essentially has volumetric lighting reduced to the point where it's almost disabled, while medium and high utilize more of this effect. In terms of performance, you get a big uplift of over 8% when you switch the lighting system from high to low. However, lighting is one of the only effects in Fallout 76 that actually looks somewhat decent, so I'd try and avoid using the low mode here, otherwise the game looks even worse. My preference here is to use medium. There's not a huge difference between high and medium visually, but you gain about 2% to your performance making the switch. Shadow quality is one of the weirdest settings in Fallout 76. It mostly governs shadow resolution, so how clean the edges of shadows are and how realistic they look. To start with, Ultra seems to use a heavy blur filter to the edge of shadows in conjunction with a high shadow resolution. In real life, shadows aren't always defined and don't necessarily have sharp edges, but usually the level of shadow softness is based on how far the shadow is from the object. Some games do use a realistic distance-based shadow system that accurately blurs shadow edges where it should, but Fallout 76 isn't one of those games, so using the Ultra Shadow mode just leaves you with blurry shadows. To me, the high mode actually looks best here, with more shadow definition as the blur filter is toned down. Then you get to the medium and low modes, which have less blurring but also lower shadow resolutions. In the case of the low mode, shadows are extremely pixelated and look like utter garbage. There's also a lot of shadow artifacting with the medium and low modes. It's really ugly and something I haven't seen in many other modern games. In terms of performance, again, high is looking like a solid choice because it gives 4% more performance than ultra for a quality improvement. So that's a pretty clear win right there. Meanwhile, there's not a lot of point using the medium or low modes. The quality downgrade is significant for a fairly small improvement to performance. And one last thing on shadows, check out the way the game renders shadows for static objects after you move. It's like the game is using some sort of temporal reconstruction for shadows to improve performance, yet performance is still bad and the shadows are still really ugly. It's kind of weird stuff there. Shadow distance probably doesn't do what you think it does. In Fallout 76, there is a fairly obvious transition where low quality far shadows are swapped out for higher resolution near shadows. I was hoping the shadow distance setting would increase the radius where near shadows are loaded, which would make this transition less obvious, but no, all the mode does is determine where the shadows are rendered for really distant objects. See this far away hill at the start of the benchmark run? Well, shadows are rendered for the trees using the high mode and are not rendered using low. And yeah, that's pretty much the main difference there. The performance difference between all 3 modes isn't all that large. You stand to gain about 2 to 3% switching to either the medium or low modes. My preference here is medium. It's hard to spot the difference even in areas with expansive views, yet you gain 3% average frame rate, so I wouldn't bother with the low setting here. The final 4 settings are all fade sliders, which essentially control draw distance, but again, they probably don't do as much for visuals and performance as you might be expecting. In particular, the actor and item fade sliders do almost nothing, so I'd recommend keeping those maxed out. The first big change is when using the object fade slider, which governs elements like trees, destroyed cars, boxes, and the usual Fallout non-movable objects. Cranking this setting down to the lowest point sees draw distances creep in slightly. It's most noticeable up on tall hills where you have a far view distance. You'll often see less trees on faraway hills, but the difference is also visible with more close range environments. While the object fade setting doesn't improve average frame rates in any significant way, it does improve 1% lows, where a middle ground setting can give upwards of a 5% improvement to 1% lows, presumably as fewer objects are loaded into the game at any one time. I'd recommend something around this middle setting to get a smoother experience, but don't expect radically better performance. Grass fade is a similar story where higher settings cause grass to appear further away, and I think this setting has more noticeable pop-in on lower settings, so ideally you'd keep it as high as your system will allow. However, you can gain a reasonable amount of performance setting it to the lowest notch on the slider, gaining 2% to average frame rates and 10% to 1% lows in our benchmark run. So that's every setting covered in Fallout 76. For those that are looking to gain a bit of performance without significantly affecting visual quality, I'd recommend the following settings: textures on ultra, water quality on low, lighting quality on medium, shadow quality on high, shadow distance on medium, and all the fade sliders as high as possible, except for object fade, which I'd set to around 50%. With these settings, you'll gain around 8% to performance for almost no difference to visual quality. It's not a radical improvement, but in a game that runs like trash, it's nice to tweak things a bit to get those higher frame rates. What surprised me most about Fallout 76's settings is that most options have very little impact on visual quality. Sure, in a game that already doesn't look great, you probably want most effects enabled to squeeze the absolute most out of this engine visually, but it's strange to see effects like screen space reflections, ambient occlusion, depth of field, and motion blur all permanently enabled. I think having the option to disable or tone down these effects could greatly help performance on lower end systems, especially because you're not going to gain much performance just simply switching to the low preset as it is. But the reality is, the engine Bethesda is using for Fallout 76, the creation engine, is well past its use-by date. It was past its use-by date with Fallout 4 in 2015, and in 2018 it's basically gone green and blue with mold. It simply should be thrown in the trash at this point. There are just so many aspects to this engine that are fundamentally flawed or broken, and I really pity the developers that have had to work with and patch up this engine over the past decade to make modern games. That's it for this one. Next game we'll be looking at is Just Cause 4, which is set to be officially released in early December, so stay tuned for that one. As always, you can subscribe for more videos just like this one. Consider supporting us on Patreon to get access to our exclusive Discord chat and monthly live streams. And I'll catch you not in Fallout 76 because I'll probably never play the game again, but in the next one.